Hey everyone, welcome to this crash course on Django. In this course, we're going to build a very basic real estate listing website where you can add listings, you can view their details, update them, delete them. And so this course is for people who have never used Django before or who are just absolute beginners when it comes to Django. I'm going to explain all of the basic concepts to give you an idea of how to use Django to build your own projects. You can also watch this course for free on learn.justdjango.com. And if you're looking to become more skilled with Django, then consider buying a membership where you can get access to over 100 hours of courses that takes you from an absolute beginner level to becoming a pro. So if you're interested, link is in the description down below. And without further ado, let's get started. So I just want to talk about the prerequisites. And even though this is a crash course, there are still some things that you need to know before starting the course. Really, you just need to know what Python is and have a basic understanding of Python. If you search on Google Python, then you'll see the first result here is python.org, and you can come to this website to learn pretty much everything there is to know about Python. There's tutorials everywhere online, so really you just need to make sure that you understand the basics of Python. If you don't or have never worked with Python before, then this is just going to be too difficult. So I would recommend that you first start by learning Python. And once you have a good understanding, then you can come over to this tutorial and start learning Django. So that's the first prerequisite. The second is that I'm going to be using an editor called VS Code or Visual Studio Code. Again, if you search on Google VS Code, then you can see the first result here is Visual Studio Code, and you can download this editor. It's not an actual prerequisite. I'm just letting you know that this is what I'm going to be using, and it's very popular, and it's pretty good for Python and general development. So you can use this, or you can use whichever editor you're currently using or most comfortable with. So Python and VS Code. And then lastly, in terms of following along with this project, you can find all the code for this entire course on the justdjango/Django real estate GitHub repository. There'll be a link in the description of the video so that you can come and access it here. And also the final code will be available here on the main branch as well. So you can always refer back to this place to see the code and compare it with your own code and see if you've gone wrong somewhere, and just generally compare it to make sure it's working. So those are the prerequisites, and now we can actually get started learning about Django. If you go to djangoproject.com, then you'll be taken to this website, which has all the documentation about the Django project and some tutorials that show you just how to get up and running and all the basic concepts about Django. Now, I'm not going to be going through all the links of the site, and I encourage you to do that to become familiar with the Django project because there's really good information here. But really, I just wanted to highlight these three things that are mentioned here on the homepage of djangoproject.com because it gives a good overview of what Django actually is and what problem it's trying to solve. And it's also just important to know really what actually is Django as a concept before getting into using it. So we can read here, Django is a high-level Python web framework. And really that's something to talk about already because a framework is something that essentially takes a lot of functionality and bundles it into one place that then you can call upon and let it do a lot of things for you so that you don't have to do those things yourself. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you can trust that the framework knows how to handle it better than you do. And so that's really what Django is at the end of the day. It's a framework that just handles a lot of things for you. So the trick with learning Django is just becoming more familiar with how Django does things for you. And if you can just learn where all the things are inside the framework and where you can access those things and how you can use them yourself, then you really can become quite proficient in Django just by learning where everything is, essentially. Now, it's built using Python, and that's why you need to have a good understanding of Python before you start working with Django, because you're going to be writing code using the Python programming language. And Django is just the name of the project that is written in Python that handles a lot of things for you. So there's just quite a lot of things in that one statement. And so it continues and says that it encourages rapid development and clean, pragmatic design. It's built by experienced developers. It takes care of much of the hassle of web development so you can focus on writing your app without needing to reinvent the wheel. It's free and open source. Right? Not a lot to explain in that. And then the 3 points here are that it's ridiculously fast, reassuringly secure, and exceedingly scalable. And so by fast, I think this is probably one of the sort of most focused on points about Django, is that you can take a concept and build it out using Django really, really quickly. It's not about speed of the actual code. It's about speed of taking ideas and turning those ideas into actual completed websites or web projects, because Django just, again, handles a lot of things for you. So you don't need to really write a lot of code to get something working as either a proof of concept or just even a fully working idea. So that's probably one of the best parts about Django, is that you can just build things really quickly. Again, that's assuming that you can just come to have a good understanding of Django and you know how to develop with it. Of course, in the beginning, it's going to feel a bit slow because you don't know where everything is. But as you get progressively better, it becomes quicker and quicker to just build something. And then being secure and scalable. Those are the other two things that it highlights here. So that's just a very basic overview of what Django is. And again, you can come over here and read a lot more about the project. And you can also go through the code on GitHub because it's open source. So that is djangoproject.com. And now we can get started with creating a project using Django. So I've got VS Code open, and the first thing that I'm going to do inside VS Code is open up a terminal. Now I'm working on Mac, but this is going to be pretty much very similar to how it would be on Windows. You might need to look up the equivalent command on Windows in case it doesn't work, because it is slightly different to run some commands, but in general, all the commands are the same. So I'll explain to you which commands could be different, but first we just need to open up a terminal, which you can use a keyboard shortcut of Command J. Again, I'm just going based off of the Mac keyboard here. And once you have a terminal open, you can then change into the directory that you want to work in. Now, right now, I'm just inside the root of my computer, but now I'm going to do this inside the downloads folder. So what you can do is you can drag a folder over onto VS Code, and it will then open VS Code inside that terminal, or you can navigate here inside the terminal, which is just a little bit quicker. So now I'm inside the downloads folder, and this is where I'm going to work for this project. So the first thing that we need to do is use something called a virtual environment, and this is basically a tool that lets you contain all of your project dependencies inside one folder or inside one environment, and that just helps with isolating those dependencies so that you can maintain the correct versions of those packages or projects that you're using. So it's just quite important, but also useful. So to use a virtual environment, I prefer to use something called virtual env, but there's a bunch of options out there that you can use. And if you don't have it installed, you need to install it, which you can do by using pip install virtual env. Now, if you don't have pip available, then you might need to use pip 3. It just depends on your computer's setup. So once you run the command to install, you'll then see here it's installing virtual env, and now it's done. And once it's installed, you can then use that command, or virtual env, to create a virtual environment folder, which looks like this. So if you do virtual env, Typically, you could create a folder called venv, which stands for virtual environment. And if you run that, then you'll get an output here just telling you that it's been created. And if I list out all of the folders inside my downloads folder, you'll see it there, virtual env. And that is the folder we just created now. Now, you need to activate a virtual environment in order to use it. So to do that on Mac, you can run source, the name of the virtual environment, and then bin activate, right? So then you'll get some feedback here, which is inside the brackets, showing you the name of the virtual environment. And that means that it's activated. And that basically means that whenever you install a package, it's going to be installed inside this virtual environment, not inside your actual computer's Python dependencies, the base dependencies. So what we're going to install is Django. So we run pip install Django, and we can see right now the latest version is 4.0.4, and you can then see other packages that are also installed, like this SQL parse and ASGI ref as well. So those are the packages that are installed, and we can actually start using Django right away. So to use Django, we can use the Django-admin command, which allows us to do a bunch of things. And one of the things we can do is call start project. So start project basically starts a project, and we give it a name, which in our case, we're going to call it the real estate project. So I'm giving it a name, and then we just hit enter. Okay, so now if we go and list out everything inside the folder again, you'll see we have a real estate folder, and that is the project that was just created now by Django from running this command. So it creates a folder, and inside that folder there are a bunch of things. So what I'm going to do is bring that into VS Code, but first I'm going to deactivate the virtual environment, which does what it says it does. It deactivates it, and then you can see that those brackets are gone, which means we're no longer inside the virtual environment. And now I'm going to go and drag this folder right over VS Code, which is the real estate folder, and we can see it here, real estate, and we can see a whole bunch of files as well, which we're going to go through. Now, if I bring up the terminal again, this is a new window of VS Code, so I'm going to need to reactivate that virtual environment, and it's actually in the folder inside downloads. So I'm just going to have to go back into that folder, reactivate the virtual environment, and then I can change back into the real estate folder. Okay, so now everything's configured, and we can talk about this real estate folder, and we can talk about all these files and what all these files do. First, we have the init.py file, and this is just empty. All this does is just make this real estate folder available as a module, and that's really a Python thing, so you don't have to worry about this file. Then you have this asgi.py file, and really all that does is just configure the Django project to be used in an asynchronous setting, and the wsgi.py file is used to run it in a traditional synchronous setting. So these two files now come by default with Django, so you can choose whether you want to run it asynchronously or traditionally just synchronously. So it's up to you. You won't really need to work in any of these files. They're just settings files provided for whichever option you want to use. The main two files here are the settings and the URLs. So I'm going to start with the settings file. And really the settings file is like the home of the Django project. It's got all these different settings and variables that you have declared for the rest of your project to access. And it contains all sorts of configurations for such as the database and for security and for pretty much everything. So it's very important that you become familiar with this file, and really you'll work a lot inside this file as well. So over time you'll get more used to where everything is. Now at the top there's a base dir variable, which basically just defines what the root of this project is, which is not this real estate folder, but actually the one above it that we opened VS Code in. That is the base directory. And that just helps Django know really where the start of the project is. That holds all of the project's code, essentially. So that is this real estate file, or folder actually, is the base directory. And that can be used to do a bunch of things. Like you'll see down here, it's used to reference where the database will be stored, and we'll see that later on. But it's just useful because it helps you to define where you can put other files and folders relative to the project. So we have the base directory. Then we have a secret key, which is a very important variable needed for Django. And it's, you can see, just given a Django insecure random secret key right now. But when you deploy a project, meaning you put it into a live production setting so that people can access it on the internet, you want to make sure that this variable is not known by anyone else, and it's a very secure variable which you can create to make sure that it's very just secure, long, and got lots of different digits and all that. Then we have whether it's got debug set as true, and debug is also a very important variable which basically determines whether or not your project is running in a deployment or in a deployed setting in production. So if you have debug set to true, then if ever you get any kind of errors, Django will give you a nice error page that tells you what line of the code was where the error was and what the error was. But if you have your project running in production, you don't want your users to be seeing those errors. So when you are in production, you'll turn this value to false, and that will then make sure that the error page is really a very vague error code that just shows the error that happened. So for example, like a 404 page not found, or if it's a more serious error, it will just say that there was an error, like a 500 status code or a 400 status code. There's plenty different status codes, and that will just be shown to the user. So it's a lot more secure instead of showing them where the actual error occurred. So this is a very important variable to know about. Then we have the allowed hosts, and this is something that you'll really need to use when you're deploying. So it's just saying if you want to deploy your project on mydomain.com, you're going to enter mydomain.com inside your allowed hosts. That's really all that's used for. Then we have some installed apps, and this is where you can install third-party apps that the community makes, and you just add the name of the app inside here, and basically it's like a plug-and-play kind of system that you can then access all these cool features from different packages, and you just have to specify the name of the package in here, and you can start using it. So also quite an important part of the Django ecosystem is the apps, and we'll talk more about that later in this course. We'll create our own app. Then we have the middleware, and this is really for a bunch of security settings essentially. So you can see here it has like django.middleware.security.security middleware, session middleware, common middleware, all these different middlewares. And this is a little bit more advanced, but basically just a lot of security settings. Then we have the root URL conf or URL configuration. And this is basically the file that we use for all of our URLs. And URLs is something we'll also talk about more in depth. But basically what this is doing is pointing to this urls.py file. That's what it's doing. So more on that later. Then we have templates, and templates is also a big part of Django. So when you write HTML, you want to tell Django where those HTML templates can be found. And you would go and put inside here DIRs, which stands for directories. You could go and add in all the different folders that Django can find those HTML templates inside. So also something we'll come back and visit. Then we have the WSGI application. So you can see here it's pointing to real estate, the folder, .wsgi, which is this WSGI, and then .application, which if we go inside, we can see application is a variable here. And really that's just grabbing something from Django. So again, all this was doing is just pointing to the WSGI file. Then we have also another very important setting, which is the databases. And this right now, Django by default provides you with a database configuration for SQLite 3, which is actually mainly supposed to be used in your local setting, like when you're doing tutorials or when you're just playing around, then you can use SQLite 3. And that's because it will actually generate a file called, in this case, db.sqlite3, which you'll see here later on. And it's an actual file. Your database is a file, but you can configure all kinds of databases here. So later when you deploy a project, you can change the type of database to be something like Postgres or really anything that has support for Django. And then we have auth password validators, which really are validation schemas for passwords. Like you can see here, it's got minimum length validator. So if you put in a password of 123, that's just too short. So it's going to validate that the password has a certain minimum length and all these other different types of validations. And then we have the internationalization, which is basically for translations. So if you want to specify a language code for something else, like any other language, then you can pass that in over here. And then there's some time zone features or settings as well. And then lastly, we come to the static files, which is something basically to store your CSS, JavaScript, and images. And that's also something that deserves a lot more attention to explain more in detail, but basically settings for where you can find all those static files. And then this is just something that's been added to Django recently in version 4, which is the default auto field. Don't need to really explain much about that. It's just a setting that was added. So that's the settings.py file. And lastly, it's this urls.py, which is what was being pointed to. If we look at here, the root URL conf, it points towards this urls.py file. And this is kind of like the starting point of all the pages or URLs that people can visit on your website. So if you have your website hosted on domain.com and you want people to go to domain.com/about us, then you'll go and add a path over here to about us, which then gets handled by a specific Python function. And so this is like a settings for all the different paths that people can go to or URLs that people can go to on your website and where those URLs get pointed to so that you can handle those URLs in whichever way you want to handle them. A little bit easier to explain with examples, but again, we'll get to all of this throughout the tutorial. And so that's the urls.py. And then the manage.py file, which is kind of like something you never really need to touch, but it's a very important file because it lets you run all sorts of commands on your Django project. And for example, we're going to do one right now, which if we open up the terminal, we can run python manage.py migrate. And if you do that, you should see in the terminal a whole bunch of messages being printed out here. And these are what are called migrations, which are operations that get applied to the database. So you can see here applying content types .001 initial, and then there's auth, admin, and a whole bunch of other. You can see there's a lot over here. And after that, you also see here db.sqlite3, which is the database file, right? And if you remember, if you come to the database setting, which is here, then you can see the name is base.dir, which is this real estate folder, right? Slash db.sqlite3, which means it gets put inside the real estate folder with this name, db.sqlite3. And that is the database. So the whole point of that was just to show you that the manage.py file is what you can use, what you just call Python. You run a Python file, which in this case is called manage.py, and you pass what the name of the command is that you want to do. So in this case, we ran the migrate command, which applies all the database migrations to the database. Right, so that is the project set up and just an overview of all those files that you get given. And it's of course a lot of information, but as we start playing around and adding some stuff to make this into a real application, you'll become more familiar with all of these folders and files. So now that we have a Django project, we can start exploring more about what Django actually provides right out of the box. So what we're going to do now is run another command using the manage.py file, and that is the Python manage.py run server command. So what that does is it starts the Django server, and you can see here it gives us a little bit of information like the version we're using and the settings file that we're using, and then it says starting development server at localhost HTTP, then on our localhost 127.0.0.1 port 8000. So you can actually click on that link and it opens up in the browser and you get this greeting screen from Django, which just tells you that the project is running and we can now actually start working with our Django project. Everything seems to be good. So the first thing out of the box that I want to show you that Django provides is the Django Admin. This is one of the most enjoyed features about using Django because Django provides this to you right out of the box and it's very convenient. So first I'm going to stop the server by pressing Control-C, and then I'm just going to clear the terminal, and I'm going to run another command using the manage.py file. So Python manage.py, and then it's going to be create super user. So if I just bring it like that, you can see here one word, create super user. And if you go through this, you'll see it's going to prompt you to answer some questions, because what we're essentially doing is creating an admin user. Okay, so here I'm going to put the username as admin, and then I'll provide an email address and then a password. The password can be a very basic password, and so I'm just going to make mine very simple as well. So you have to confirm the password, and you'll get a warning here which says the password is too common, but it's really okay. We're just testing things out. So you can bypass password validation and create user anyway. I'm going to say yes, Y. And then if you hit enter, it'll say successfully created. So now we have a user, an admin user, which we can use to log into the Django admin. So again, to see the admin, we're going to run the server. So I'm going to run that command again. All right, we see the server is running. So coming back here to the browser, I'm going to go to our localhost /admin. And then you'll see here, you get this form that you use to log in, right? Just a typical login form. The username I put in was admin. I'm going to put the password in, hit enter, and we're logged in. All right, so this is the Django admin, and right now there's not a lot of things that you can see or do, but there are two things, which is groups and users. Now I'm just going to focus on users. So if we click on that, we can see here the user that I just created. Okay, the username is admin. Here's the email address. It doesn't have a first name and last name. And then very important is it has this staff status, which is set to true, which means that this user is a staff user. And we know that because we were able to log into the Django admin. So any other type of user that's not a staff user will not be able to log into this Django admin portal. So it's really kind of like a backend for your Django project that only staff users can log into. Right, so this is the Django admin. It's probably one of the coolest features about Django because you didn't have to do anything to get this. It just comes with it. And you'll probably come into this a few times because as we start building things into this project, you'll see things on this left-hand side, this kind of little dashboard or navigation here. It's going to provide us with some more links for all the different things we add to the project. Okay, so we'll see that as we progress. So coming back to VS Code, what we're going to do now is use another command, part of the manage.py file, and that is python manage.py start app. And you'll see what this does. So first I'm going to give it a name and I'm going to call it listings. So we hit enter. And if we look over here, we can see we have a listings folder now. And that comes with a lot of files for us. So we can see init.py, which is again just a Python file, admin.py, apps.py, models, tests, and views. All of these files are used to just store specific things to contain them in those files, which just makes for a convention that everyone is used to. And we'll go through each of those files as we need to figure out what they're about. So we'll get to each one. And also very important is this migrations folder, which right now is empty, but we'll see what that does soon as well. So we have this app called listings, and the reason why we created this folder is so that we can store everything that has to do about these real estate listings. We can put them in one place or inside one folder so that we know what this app is about, and it's about real estate listings. Okay, so everything that has to do with that, we're going to be working with inside this folder. Now, whenever you create an app, you need to tell Django that that is an app you want to include in the project. And so the way you do that is by going into essentially your home project folder, which in this case is called real estate. And you're going to go into the settings.py file, and we're going to go all the way to the installed apps. Right? So this is something we saw earlier on. Installed apps is a list of all the apps in your project. And what you do is you add the name of the app you just created, which in our case is called listings. So we just add that to the list, and this tells Django that it should consider this listings folder as an app for the project, and now we can start using it. And so to make sure everything is still running correctly, we can go back to run the server, and we don't get any kind of warnings or errors. Normally, well, if there's any kind of issue, the server, whenever you try to run the server, Django will print out the error message or the warning message here for you to see so that you can fix that and continue. If it's a serious error, sometimes the server won't even start, so you'll just need to fix the error before running the server again. But right now, everything looks good, so we don't have any issues. We can close settings.py, and we're going to work inside the listings folder. And this is where we're going to start with one of the most important concepts inside working with Django, which is models. And you can see here we have a models.py file. Now, you're going to work inside the models.py file to create what are called models. And really, models are representations of your database schema. So if you think about tables inside a database, models are just converting those tables into a Python object, which allows you to interact with that database table. So you can add items to the database, or you can update them, or you can delete them, or you can fetch them. So it's a way of interacting with the database through these Python classes that you're going to see now. So the way you create a model is by firstly creating a Python class. So we use the class keyword and we call it whatever we want to call the model. So in our case, we're dealing with real estate listings. So we're going to create a model called a listing, and we open up the brackets because this class is going to inherit some properties from Django. Remember, Django handles a lot of things for us, and one of the things is database schema representation. So we inherit from the models.model with a capital M here, and that means that our class will be interpreted as essentially a database table, okay? So on this model, we can add all sorts of information about what this table is going to include, like all the columns in a table. If you think about a database table, you might have a unique ID so that each row in the database is unique, and all sorts of different fields. Now, when it comes to this listing, if we think about what a real estate listing has, just go to any kind of real estate site and you can see all of the information that is on a real estate page. So we're going to do that now. I'm going to go and just put here pass, which basically just allows us to keep this class as it is right now, and I can just save this file. And I'm going to head over to the browser. And what I've just done is searched here in Google for Remax, which is one of the more well-known real estate websites. So I'm going to go to remax.com and we can just search for any kind of city. If I just search like New York, right, and we go to look at these results, then we can see here, this is really just what I wanted to show, is you have all this information for a single listing. You have an image, you have a price, the number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, the square footage, right? So some basic information. And sometimes, oh, well, of course, you've also got the address, but sometimes they don't show the address. And sometimes they also have like a description of this listing, right? It might be some sort of nice description to make it enticing to want to know more, like some sort of house on a hill with a great view, right? Some sort of description as well. So when we talk about a listing model now, we need to think about it in terms of what data or what information would a listing on a website show. And that is the information that you would want to store inside the database. So if we come back here to the model, we could think about it in terms of what we just saw and say, okay, well, what does a listing have? It might have a title, it has a price, it has the number of bedrooms, it has the number of bathrooms, it has the square footage. So we could just call it whatever we want to call it, really. We can say square footage like this, or you can shorten it, right? So it's got that information. It sometimes has the address, not always, but maybe the address, right? And it had an image as well, or a thumbnail. Okay, so all that information is stored on the model. And the way that we now, well, describe these columns in the database is by using Django's models to add what kind of data or what type of data each of these are going to be. So just by showing you, a title would be represented by using what is a character field. So we use models, again, coming from Django, models.character field. And this basically just means that the type of data stored inside the database is a string. Okay, so we open up the brackets here. And now whenever you do a character field, you need to specify the maximum length which you could say is maybe 150 characters, right? So that's the type of data. It's a string. If we think about the price, a price is not a string, it's a number. So in that case, we would use an integer field. So we use these fields, that's what we call these items on the class, they're called fields. And we use these fields to really define what type of data each of these fields is going to contain, right? So the price is an integer field. The number of bedrooms is also an integer field because it can only be an integer. Same thing for the number of bathrooms. Square footage as well, it's an integer. Of course, you can start saying, okay, well, the price could be, it could have decimal points as well. And in those cases, then you can change it to be either a decimal field or a float field, but we're going to keep it simple and just work with integers. Then we have the address, which is also a string, and I'm just going to use a character field as well and specify the maximum length to be 100 characters. Okay. Now images are slightly more complicated, so I'm going to just leave that out for right now, and we'll just work with these fields for the moment. Now, this is basically a model that we can start working with, and one of the things that we do, or there's a few things that you do when you create a model, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a migration, which is basically going to create a new file for Django to keep record of all the database changes that we're making. So I'm going to stop the server. I'm going to run python manage.py, make migrations. And that is also, again, another manage.py command. So this one's called make migrations. And we can see here, we get this little output that says migrations for the listings app. And we see listings migrations 001 underscore initial.py. And that's because if you go inside the listings folder, inside the migrations folder, you can now see that there's a new file here called 001 underscore initial.py. So this file, if we take a look at it, is for basically record keeping of changes we're making to the database. And it's a migration, that's a class called migration, inheriting from something coming from Django, and it has some operations to apply to the database, which in this case, what it does is it creates a model called listing with all of these fields, right? You can also see a field here that we didn't add, which is called ID. And this is added by default because it has to have some sort of primary key. So if you know a little bit about databases, database tables need to have what's called a primary key, which basically maintains that each record in the database is unique. Okay, so this is added by default, and then all the rest of the fields that we added as well. So every time you make a change to these models, if we were to now go and add the image field, then that would be a new change, and we would create another file with only the image field being added. It would be a new change to the model. So those changes get recorded here, and that's just because if you think about deploying this website to a live production environment, we need to make sure that every time the changes are made in our testing environment, those same changes get applied to the production environment so that we are keeping all of the changes consistent in the environments and making sure that we don't have any kind of misalignment of what the actual database schema is and what is represented here inside the code. So it's very important to understand migrations and just to keep record of them. But Django, again, does all of that for us. So that is the first thing you do when you have a new model or when you make changes to a model, is you make a migration. And this doesn't mean that this is now applied to the database. So this is just an important bit to understand here. This right now is just a record of the change. It's just a file for Django to keep record in our project. But in order to apply that migration to the database, we need to run manage.py migrate. And if you do that, you can see here applying listings 001 initial and then OK. And that means that this file, the changes in that file were actually applied to the database. So now if we were to go and take a look at the database and inspect it, we would see a table called listing, and we would see all these different fields represented as columns on the database. So we've created the file using make migrations. We've applied the migration to the database using migrate. And now we can actually start doing things to the database table. We can start adding listings. We can start retrieving all the listings and so forth. So the first thing is to make sure that once you've got this model, you've made the migrations and you've applied it to the database. And now we can go and run the server. Okay, so the server is running. And another just good practice to do is that once you have a model, you bring it into the admin.py file, right, inside our listings app. And so to bring it in here, we need to import it. So we say from .models import the listing. Then we just come a bit down and we say admin.site.register the listing model. And basically what this does is it brings it into the Django admin, and we'll see that now. So let's go back here to the Django admin, refresh the page, and now you'll see a new section here under the admin, which is called listings. The reason it's called listings is because that's the name of the app. And we see here listings, which is the model listings. So let's go click on listings, and right now we don't have any, so it just says 0 listings. But we can also start adding listings. So let's do that. We're going to add listings, and now we have this form with all of the fields that we see corresponding to the model, right? If we look at the model, all of these fields here are all of these fields here. So let's just go and add some dummy listing here. I'm just going to call it a nice house on the hill. I'm going to add a price, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, square footage, and an address. And we click save. And now we have one listing in the database. Now you can see here it says listing object 1, which is very kind of confusing as to how would we know what listing it is. And that's just because if we come back to the model, we can change the way that these models are represented as strings. Because right now it's trying to kind of show us the name of this model, of this listing, but there isn't really a name, and that's actually the string representation, because this is a string right now. If we think about it in terms of data types, it's a string. So what you can do is on any Python class, but also on Django models, you can add the string method, which takes in self, because it's Python. You need to pass in the self when you're working with classes. And here we're just going to return self.title. Right, so title being one of the properties here on the Python class, we can just return the title whenever we represent this model as a string. And what that does is if we come back here and refresh the page, now we see the title, nice house on the hill, instead of just listing object 1. Okay, this is a little bit nicer, so that now we can immediately recognize that this is that listing. Okay, so we've created a model. First of all, we created an app. If we just recap quickly what we've done, we created a listings app. We registered it in our settings inside settings.py, we created a listing model to represent real estate listings. We took that model and added it to the admin and registered it here so that we can work with it inside the Django admin. And we've also made migrations to apply it to the database, which is why we can work with it in the first place. So a few things there that we've done. Okay, the next big part of Django is views. So views, you can see we actually have a file here called views.py. This is where you're going to handle, essentially you could think of it as logic to handle what happens when a user goes to a page on your website. And so whenever you navigate to a specific page, there's a corresponding bit of code that runs every time you go to that page. And this could be to do any kind of action, right? It could be to create something, to fetch something, really anything you want. But typically you have views that follow what is called CRUD, which is an acronym that stands for different actions. You can apply this to the database if you think about databases, but also if you think about it in terms of website pages, right? Like actions that you want to perform. And that stands for create, retrieve, update, and delete. And there's also one more which isn't listed in there, and that is list. Sometimes you want to list out something. Retrieve normally refers to retrieving one instance, or actually one specific record, whereas listing is when you fetch multiple records. Now, what we're going to do is create views that perform these actions. Okay, so if we apply this thinking to our model, the listing over here, we're going to have a view that creates listings, a view that fetches or retrieves a specific listing, a view that updates a specific listing, a view that deletes a specific listing, and a view that lists out multiple listings. Now, the easiest one to do right now is the listing functionality because, well, it's normally the first thing that you want to see is to list them all out. And so we're going to create a view and just demonstrate the idea about what views do, and then we'll get into the rest of the other ones. So with inside Django, you can work with views using functions, or you can use classes. Now, for beginners, I would just use functions because it's a little bit simpler to read, and normally the classes abstract a lot of things away from you, so you won't really understand it in the beginning. But as you get progressively more comfortable with Django, you can start using classes if you just want to have Django do a lot of things for you as well. But it's really just a personal preference. So we're going to use functions, and so we define the function and we give it a name, which I'm going to call our listing, or we could say real estate listing, right? Whatever the name we want to call it, listing list, okay? So meaning the name of the model underscore the name of the action. This is not just, it's just a convention. I'm just doing it to keep it consistent, because later we're going to have listing underscore create, listing underscore retrieve, etc. So we create this function, and at the end we're going to return something. Now, Django functions require that you pass in one argument called the request. So this is quite literally the request coming from the browser, coming from the user when they go to a specific page. This is the request, which contains a whole bunch of information, but really we're not going to need to look at a lot of it. We just need to pass it in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to fetch all of the listings in the database. And this brings in another concept into what we're doing with views, which is using the Django ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapper. And really what this allows us to do is to use our models to fetch data from the database. So first we need to import our model, which is inside our models.py file. So we say from .models, import the listing model. So now that we have the listing model, we can work with it. Now, if we just take a quick look at it, one of the things that Django's models includes by default, which you don't see over here, but inside Django's model, one of the things that it has is an objects property, which basically allows you to say listing.objects. VS Code helps to give you code suggestions, but even if you didn't have this, objects is a property on the listing model and on all models. And what you can then do using this .objects is you can perform different operations on the database. So if I do dot again, now it's going to show me a whole bunch of suggestions here. And these are all different things that we can do on the database. So for example, if we do .all, you call this because it's a function, right, that we call, or a method technically on the objects class, but we call it like a function. And what this does is it fetches all of the listings, right? Because we're working with the listing model, it fetches all of them from the database. And we can do all sorts of different calls here. We can say .create, we can say .update, .delete, right? There's a whole bunch of different methods that we can call to do certain actions. Again, referring back to this CRUD acronym, right? So in our case, we want to list all of the listings. So we're going to use that .all that we saw here, and we're going to store that inside this variable, which we'll call listings. Okay, so we have all the listings, which is the first thing that we need to do. We actually need to fetch all the listings. Now we need to return these listings in a response for this request, right? That's what we need to return. Now there's many ways that you can return responses in Django, but one of the most basic ways you can do it is by returning a render, and a render takes in the request. It's the first argument. The second argument is the name of a template or an HTML file that you want to return. So I'm going to call this the listings.html file, which doesn't exist yet. We're going to create it in a second. And then the last argument here is context. And context is basically data that you want to inject into this template, right? Context is actually a Python dictionary. So we open up the dictionary brackets, and then we pass in the key, which I'm going to call listings just to be consistent, and the value listings. So essentially what we've done is created a dictionary with our key pointing to this database call, which fetches all of the listings. And then we pass that context dictionary here inside our render, which is what gets returned to the user as a response. So we pass in the request because it's just required. We pass in the template that we want to return, and we pass in context that we want injected into the template. Right, now we don't have listings.html anyway, so we need to create this. And if you remember, inside our real estate folder, if we go to settings.py and we scroll down to this templates configuration, this is where I mentioned that you can add folders for Django to detect all of these HTML templates that we work with. And so we're going to add a template path inside this directories list for Django to detect all of the templates there. So this is going to be our base dir, which is defined all the way at the top over here. And all we need to do is just put slash and then the name of the path or the folder that we want to look inside, which is going to be called templates. All right, now templates is just a convention, but you can call it whatever you want. And so we now need to create a folder inside our project called templates. Right, so there it is, templates. And this is where we're going to add all of the templates or HTML files, really, that we're going to work with. So we can close the settings, and we're going to create a file called listings.html because that's what we've been referring to over there. So inside the templates folder, we create this new file, listings.html. And here we can just start writing normal HTML. If you've ever worked with HTML, you can come and add it here. You can add all your styling and all the attributes and make it look really good. But really, we want to do one thing, which right now is just to display all of the listings. So Django has a syntax for templates that is actually comes from something called Ginger, which is a specific HTML syntax for injecting and working with data inside of HTML templates. All right, so it's something that is quite essentially very similar to writing Python inside HTML. And so if you've ever used a for loop inside Python, right, if you're looping through something like for item in items, right, it looks very similar. It's just the syntax is slightly different, and that's because you have to use these brackets and then the percentage signs, and then close it with percentage signs and then the bracket. And what we do is we use for, all right, so again, like a for loop. And what we can do is say for listing in listings. All right, we know that we can use the word listings because inside our context, we've given a variable key called listings. All right, so listings is going to be a list of all of these objects, all of these listings from the database. So we're looping through those listings using the keyword listing. And we need to say end for at the end of this for loop to tell Django where the for loop ends. So again, that's just part of the syntax that you learn. Once you've defined the for loop, now we can go and write what HTML we want to loop through and create for every single listing. So I'm just going to put a paragraph tag, and inside the paragraph tag, I'm going to put, using these double brackets syntax, the variable name listing, and then I'm going to access the title from the listing. The reason I can access the title is because on the model, we have a field called title. So every listing is a listing from the database, and we can access the title, we can access all the other fields from the listing. All right, so I'm doing it like this. And what we should see if we save this file is essentially a list of paragraph tags that show all of the different listing titles, right? Now let's come back to views, and we save this. And there's one last thing that we need to do to make this view complete, which is that we need to tell Django to use this view when a user goes to a specific path on our website. So the way that we do that is by going into our real estate folder, into the urls.py. I'm going to remove this giant comment, and I'm going to import the view that we just created. So this comes from listings, the name of the app, .views, import listing list. Okay. So we import the view that we just created, and then we're going to create a path, which is actually just going to be an empty path for now. And we're going to use the listing list. So the argument that we pass in, the second argument for the path, is the name of the function that we want Django to use to handle whenever a user goes to this path, which is an empty string. what this means is if we come to the server here, or the project in the browser, and we just go to the base URL, here we can see the response, nice house on the hill, right? That's the first listing that we created in the database. So a couple things just to recap on all the concepts here. First, if we go back to listings and we go to views, we created a function called listing list, taking in a request. It fetches all the listings. It passes them into a context dictionary, which we then render. So render basically takes a template with some context and returns that template as a response. Now, template is just the name that we use in Django, but really it's just an HTML file, which we configured Django to look for inside the templates folder. So listings.html is over here. And then we loop through all those listings from the context. And we really just put it inside a paragraph tag, just the listing title for now. All right, so we configure all of that, and then we just bring the view into our URLs to say that whenever we navigate to this path, that it uses the listing list to handle what happens when you go to that path. Now imagine I change this path to be listings, and I'm putting a slash at the end of that as well. Then what that means is if we come back here and we refresh this, you can see we get a 404, page not found, because we're no longer handling this URL, this path on the server. So we can actually see Django provides us with all the URLs that it tried, which was admin, right? We know it's not admin. And then we have listings. So if we try and go to /listings, and we could put a slash at the end, but if you don't, it's just going to redirect you to with a slash at the end. And now we see nice house on the hill. So that is what this path does. Now I'm just going to keep it empty because that's a little bit more conventional, just easier for what we want to do. So with an empty path, that means if we come over here and refresh it, now it's just 404 on the listings path. But if we go back to the base URL, we see that it works again, right? So that is what a view does, and it really brings a lot of concepts together inside Django because you need to fetch data from the database, pass that data into some sort of context or some way of just injecting it into a template, and then return that template, that HTML, as a response. All right, so we've gone and done the listing view. All right, but there's also 4 other views that we can do here to retrieve, create, update, and delete. Now we're going to do the retrieve view, which is almost the same as this, just one small difference that we need to go through. So I'm going to create another function called the listing retrieve function. This also takes in a request. And just like we did with all of these steps, we need to fetch a listing, create some context, and render that request and return it. Now, because we are retrieving one specific listing, that means that we need to have a way to identify which listing we're retrieving. So if we look at the model, are we going to fetch it that has a specific title, the one that has a specific price, right? Like how are we going to fetch that specific listing? And the easiest way to do that is to use the primary key on the model, which if you look at the migrations, that is this ID field. And this, again, we don't see it on the model, but it's added to it by default. So what you can do is you can fetch a listing using its ID, because we know that the ID is a unique value, and that's a way that we can always make sure that we're fetching a unique listing from the database. So in order to fetch a specific item, we're going to pass in another argument here into the function, which is the ID. All right, so that ID is going to be used to fetch a specific listing. And so what we can do is say listing equals to listing, the class, dot objects, dot get, right? So get is a method we can call to get a specific listing. And here we pass in how we want to get that listing, which is going to be using the ID field on the model, which was added by default, equal to the ID passed into the function here. So this ID is this ID here, right? They're the same value. It's being passed in to the function here. And we are basically trying to see if there is a listing with the ID passed into this listing retrieve. So once we have the listing, then it's pretty much exactly the same thing that we did in the listing list, which is that we create some context. We create a variable called listing, or whatever you want to call it, specify the value, and then we return a render of the request with the name of the template, which I'm going to call listing singular.html, and then pass in the context again. Now, you might be wondering, how does this ID, this second argument, get passed into the function? And that's when it comes down to the URLs. If we go to urls.py, here we're going to import this function again. So listing retrieve is here. And now we create another path for it, right? I'm going to do this on listings, okay, slash, and now we need some way of identifying which listing we are navigating to, because again, we're retrieving a specific listing. And this is where you can use Django's smart URL paths to basically configure the different identifiers in a URL. And so we use these brackets and then pass in the name of the argument that we want to use for how we want to filter it. So basically we can call it ID, right? But typically when you work with IDs, Django by default supports PK, which stands for primary key. Primary key, PK, is supported by default. If you change it to something else, you need to specify a little bit more information. But if we just leave it like this with PK, then it means that if we go back to the view, this argument now needs to be called PK, right, to match the name inside the URL. So this is called a keyword argument, PK, and it gets passed in over here. And that means we need to change ID equal to the PK passed in, right? So all you have to remember is just that in the URL, whatever you use here as the identifier is the name of the argument that goes into the function. So now via the URL, we have a way of knowing which listing we are navigating to and which one we're going to be fetching, okay? So if we save this and we save this, the last thing we need to do is create a template because it doesn't exist right now, and that's listing.html. This is going to be inside the templates folder again. So we create listing.html. And then here, what I'm going to do is basically just display a whole bunch of information from that specific listing. So I'm going to do listing.title. Then we can do listing.price. We can put a $sign in front of it. We can do listing.address. Right, so we're displaying these 3 bits of information, okay? And so now let's just check the server is still running. And I actually can see here I got an error, which is that missing one required positional argument, which is the view. This comes in to real estate URLs. I actually forgot to specify the view that we need to use here, and that's, so comma, specify listing retrieve as the view. We save this and then we can see that warning goes away. So now we can try and test this out. So if we go to /1, or actually /listings/1, that will take us to the listing that has a primary key or an ID of a value of 1. And if we hit enter, we can see that we get a response here with the title, Nice House on the Hill. We see it's the same one, the price, and we see the address, right? So all of that information is now being displayed in the template coming from that specific listing. And if we want to make the navigation a bit better between those two templates, then what we can do is go to listings.html and we can change this P tag into an A tag, which makes it a link. And we specify the href property to be /listings/ and then we dynamically output using the Django template syntax listing.id and then a slash at the end. So that means if we click on this title, it will then take us to this path, which is going to use the ID of the listing as the unique identifier. So if we go back to our base path here, we can see here it is. We click on that and it takes us to that path and we see again all the information for that specific listing. So that seems to be working pretty well. And that is how we can do the listing retrieve view, right? We've done 2 of these 5 actions, so we can now list them, we can retrieve them, and really the remaining ones are the create, update, and delete. Now, when it comes to creating and updating, we actually need to submit a form. And forms are actually an entire subject of its own inside Django, because forms are a big part of web development in general, because we always work with forms whenever we're submitting data. And so Django has its own sub module to deal with just forms. So we're going to work with that now and just cover it briefly. So inside our listings folder, I'm going to create a file called forms.py. And then here we're going to say from Django.forms, right? That's the forms module, import. And here we have 2 different forms we can work with. We can import the model form, which is basically a form that gets generated from a model. And it's a very easy form or way of building forms because it's basically Django doing everything for you. Or you can work with a form, just like that form. This is going to require you to do a little bit more manual work. So we're going to use the model form because it's just a bit easier. So we have the form, and then we're going to import our model that we want to work with, which comes from .models, import the listing model. And then we can go and create our own form, and we can give it a name such as, let's say, again, this is going to be a class, and it's going to be called listing form, for example. We open the brackets and we make sure that it inherits from the model form that comes from Django. So this makes sure that our form has all sorts of functionality that Django provides it. And we need to follow a specific convention, which requires us to specify the class meta. And this looks a bit funny because we're defining a class inside a class, but it's required when you deal with the model form, because here you need to specify what model you're actually working with. And that is specified as the listing model. So we specify it there. And then lastly, we just need to define the fields that we want to work with. Okay, so fields is a list of the field names that you want to have on the form. So basically we can decide, do we want title, price, number of bedrooms, what do we want to actually show on the form? And that's pretty much everything. So I'm just going to copy all of these fields. All right, so we copy them, and it's just the names of the fields. We come into this array, or this list actually, it's Python list. We paste all of the names and just make sure that you put them as strings, right? So I'm putting strings around each of these values. So it's, again, just the names of the fields that are going to go into the form. And then that's it. That's the form definition. Okay, and Django will handle so much that has to do with creating this form that we'll see it in action in a second. So we have the form. Now we need to go back into the view and we're going to use that form. So I'm going to import it from .forms, importing the listing form. And then we can go and create another view, which I'm going to call the listing create. Okay. This is just going to take in a request, right? We don't need to pass in a primary key because we're just going to be submitting a form. We don't need a unique identifier. And here what I'm going to do is create a variable called form. And I'm going to basically instantiate, meaning use the brackets here to call this class and create a new listing form that's an empty form. And just like how we've been returning a response that has an HTML file, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to return a render of the request, and we're going to give it a file name, right? Listing create.html, and we pass in the context. The context I'm going to create again here as a dictionary, and I'm just going to pass in form referring back to this empty form. Okay. Inside templates, we need to create that file now, which is going to be the listing create.html file. And here we just need to essentially create an HTML form and just use some more template syntax from Django that helps us with submitting forms. So in HTML, when we create a form, you use the form tag, and normally you would need to create an input tag, and you would need to create, for example, if you wanted to do a text area, you would create a text area tag. You can do all sorts of checkboxes, selects, all of that sort of things. But with Django, when you use Django forms, all of those fields, right? Input, text area, you don't need to do any of that. Django will do it all for you. And so all you need to do is just use the template syntax to access the form. All right, now form is available because we're passing it in here, form. So we have the form available, and we can display it in different ways. We can say .as p, which means as paragraphs. And this is just a little bit nicer instead of displaying it in the default way. So we're going to do it like that. And so immediately we can actually go and see what this looks like already. So I'm going to save this, and we're just going to need to bring listing create, right? This is our view. We need to bring it into the URL. So once again, bring it into the urls.py, paste it here as an imported view, and then we go and add another path, which I'm going to call add listing, right? We put a comma, and then the second argument is the name of the function, which is listing create. Right, so we save that, check the server is running, and it seems it can't import it, which is because I haven't saved this file yet. So if I just save the file, now that warning goes away. Okay, so what we are expecting to see here is really just the form being displayed. So we're going to come over here, and I'm going to go to add listing. Okay, and here we go. We can see a form, right? We see the title, price, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, right? Everything. So those are all the fields that are getting displayed for us. And Django handles displaying what type of field it is, right? Because remember, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and square footage, and price as well, they're all integers. So all of these fields, you can see here, they're integer fields, whereas the title and the address are character fields, they're text input. So Django matches the type of model field to the type of form field it should be when you're displaying it as a form, which is really cool. So right now we are just displaying an empty form, but we're not actually handling what happens if you submit this form, right? That's a very specific thing we need to handle, and it requires a little bit more logic and just understanding of Django's forms, but it's not too difficult. It's just becoming familiar with the process. So right now we are creating an empty form, but we only want to do this if it's a GET request that we are sending. GET requests are like if I come here and I hit enter, okay, it's sending a request to fetch this page. It's a GET request. That is a GET request. But if I submit this form, we can define what type of request we want it to be when we submit the form. Right? The way that we do that is by going onto the template or onto the form and specifying the method. Right? So we specify method, and you can see here you get prompted as either get or post. This is going to be a post request, okay, which means it's a specific type of request. It's not a GET request, and that means you need to handle it a bit differently, because otherwise it's going to handle it exactly the same way as it's doing right now, regardless of the type of request. And that's not actually what you want to do. You want to handle what happens when they submit the form, what was the information inside the form, and then do something with that form, okay? But before we come back to this, I want to finish off this HTML form, and that's with two things. The first thing is that we need to specify, using the squiggly bracket %sign syntax, we want to pass in here the CSRF token. This is required whenever you deal with forms that submit post requests. It's a security thing, so you just need to pass this in. You just need to remember that. And then lastly, we need to add a button, because we need to actually be able to submit the form. And I'm just going to put submit. All right. You can also specify the type of button. If you want to be a little bit more explicit, you can just say type equals submit. Okay. So now we have a button. And if we come back here and refresh the page, you can see there's the button. And that really finishes off our listing create template for now. So we can close that. And now we're going to handle what happens if it's a post request that we are receiving, not a GET request. And the way we do that is by saying if request.method equals to a post request, right? Or post. Okay, so that's what we're checking for. If it is a post request, we're going to do something with that data. And what we're going to do is actually create the form again. So I'm going to say form equals to listing form. But instead of creating it as an empty form, which is what happens when you do this, this makes it an empty form, we're going to pass in the data from the post request. And that's by doing this request.post, like that. And so we're essentially populating the form with all of the request data. And because this is a model form, Django does a lot of things to validate each of those fields and make sure that they're all valid submissions of data. If there's any errors, Django will basically reject that the form is valid, and we can display those error messages in the response as well. So that's pretty cool. So what we're doing by creating this form with the data is so that we can check if form.isValid. And this is a method that you can call on any form, not only model forms, on any form. And if it's valid, then we do something. If it's not valid, we basically do the opposite, or we can handle it however we want to. So if the form is valid, then we can do a bunch of things, which I'm going to come back to. So we'll come back to this, and I'm just going to say pass. Okay. At the end of it, we're going to return. All right, return means that all of this gets cut off. It ends right here. The reason for that is because we don't want it to actually continue, because then it's just going to create a new empty form, create new context, and return a response of an empty form. That's not what we want to do. And really what we want to do is actually just pretty much what we did right here. So I'm just copying and pasting this line. We're rendering a request in the same template with context, and the context I'm going to redo here as well. So right above this line, okay, we're adding context with the form and returning a render. And what this does is essentially it will use the populated form inside this context instead of an empty form. Now you can be a bit smarter than this. Instead of coding all of this out, you can actually remove it and just bring this all the way to the top. And so what that does is it will start with an empty form by default, but if it's a post request, then we take the form and pass in the requested or post data, and then we check if the form is valid and we do certain things, and at the end of it, either way, we're still going to create context and render a request with that context. So let's just save this. We're going to come over here, and what I'm actually going to do before we just submit the form is I'm going to print the request.post just so that you can see what that data looks like. And so now let's just say this is the second house, and we just fill in the form. We hit submit, right? We come back over here. It didn't look like anything happened, but there was something that happened. You can actually see here's the query dictionary, right? This is what's part of the post request. It has a CSRF middleware token, which is a security token that we added to the form here, CSRF token, right? So we see that in the data, and then we can even see all of the values of the form, right? Title, price, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, square footage, and address. And we didn't do anything with that data. All we did was just pass, which means we came straight back to here and just rendered that form with the post request and returned that form to the browser as a response. So that's why it still looks like this, because we submitted the form and Django just basically populated the form and sent it right back to us. That's what we did. Now we don't actually want to do that if that's not necessary. So what we really want to do is we want to create a new listing with all of that data. And so when you work with model forms, it's very convenient because all you have to do is just call form.save. And that's it. That's all you have to do. Form.save is available on model forms because you're working with a model. So you're saving all that data to the database as a listing model. Okay. So if it's valid, we're essentially just saying save all that data as a new listing. And then what we can do is we can actually redirect them. So this will essentially make it look like the form has been submitted and we won't get that full populated form again. So we're going to return a redirect. Now, redirect is something that comes from Django. So here we can import this from Django's shortcuts module. Okay, we can find it there. So we import redirect, and then all we do is just pass in where we want to redirect them to. And we're going to redirect them right back to this page, or we could take them to the listings page, which is on /, right? Just like that. So let's save this and test it out. And now I'm going to submit this form again. And you can see we get redirected to the base URL. And now we have two houses or two listings. Nice house on the hill and the second house. We can click on the second house and we see all the information about it. There's the first house, right? So we successfully created a house, right, using this view. Okay. So just reviewing it, there's a couple things again. We create a form, which we specified specifically in the forms.py file because it has to do with just forms. We specified all the fields that we want. We brought that form into our views and we created it inside the view by default as an empty form. But if there is a post request, we then populate the form with the data. We check if it's valid. If it's not valid, it's just going to go straight here. So that's, remember, if it's not valid, we just go straight to this step. But if it is valid, we save it and we redirect to the home page. All right, that is a listing create view complete. The last ones to go and do are the update and delete views, and they're both very similar. So the listing update view, I'm basically just going to copy the create view and paste it here, and then just rename this one to be listing update. Now, when it comes to updating, you actually have to update a specific instance or a specific listing. So that means we need to go back to passing in the primary key into the function, because we need to fetch the specific listing like we did here inside the detail view or this retrieve view. So you can copy this line, and we're going to do it right after we initialize the form. So here we do listing equals listing.objects.get, where the ID is the primary key passed in. And now when you deal with the form that has to do with updating a specific instance, all you have to do is just pass in an argument into the form, which is instance. You can actually see you get prompted it there. Instance equals to listing. All right, so this is a model form. So we're passing in the instance to update, which is this specific listing. And we need to pass it into the post request form here as well, in case it's a post request. That basically means we'd be submitting the form again. And then it's really the same thing again. You just check if the form is valid, save the form and redirect. Again, we pass the context in here. And if we want, we can create a new template to work out of. So this could be listing update.html. And then we can go and create that listing update.html. It's going to be very similar to the listing create. So you can copy everything from there and paste it here. And that's it. It's the same form. So we just save all of this. And now we need to bring the listing update view into our URLs. So we're going to go into the urls.py. And now I'm just going to fix the import structure a little bit so it's a bit easier to read. So we have everything like this now. And now we can basically just go and add a path that looks very similar to the listings retrieve path. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And then here I'm just going to put /edit at the end and use the listing update view to handle that path. All right, so if we save this, check the server, everything seems to be running. We come back here to the browser, and what I'm going to do is go to the second house and then put just edit on the end there, hit enter, and you can see now you get a populated form with all of the data for this specific listing, right? Now see if I change the price to something else, right? Like 9999, hit submit. Okay, let's go back to the second house, and you can see there the price has been updated, right? So even though we're calling form.save, because we passed in that there's an instance here, Django knows that we're updating a specific listing and we're not creating a new one. So that's why this instance is so important. So almost the same as the listing create. It's just all we needed to do was just pass in what listing we are updating. So that is the listing update view. And then the listing delete view is also almost the same. So here we just say define listing delete, taking in a request and a primary key, again, because we're deleting a specific listing. And here we're going to fetch that listing again. So we say listing equals listing.objects.get for that specific primary key. And then we just delete it. So we say listing.delete, right? Now, once it's deleted, you can't show it again because it's deleted. So the best at this point is to just redirect back to the home page. And once we redirect back there, we should see that there's one less listing than before because we just deleted that listing. So now we need to again bring this into the URLs. So import it. And here what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to make a path just like the edit one. And this is going to be /delete. It's going to use listing delete, right, as the view to handle this specific path. And like that, again, check the server. It seems like it's okay. Bear in mind that in this one, we didn't even need to really use the request. We didn't need to return a render, right, like we did for the other ones, because all we're doing is just handling that. We're fetching this one, deleting it, and then redirecting. And the way that that would look like is if we come over here and say you want to delete this listing number 2, we just put /delete on the end there, hit enter, and you see we just get redirected back to this page here, and we no longer have the second listing, which means it was deleted. So at this point, we're pretty much done and have covered most of the basics of understanding how to use Django. And really, to make this site just a little bit more, well, better looking and just nicer to navigate, you can use something like Tailwind CSS to just get the styling, and you can work on the templates to get it to just function a little bit better with some links to some of the pages to create new listings and go back to the home page. So that's what we're going to do now. Tailwind CSS is just one example of what you can use to style your templates. You can use Bootstrap, you can use anything really, or you can just customize it yourself. You don't need to use anything like Tailwind or Bootstrap, but this just makes it very quick and easy to style it. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to go under installation and click on play CDN. And all you need to do is just copy this script tag so that you can start adding Tailwind to your site. So we come back over here and we can close pretty much all of the Python files because now we're going to be working out of our templates. And one of the cool things with Django is that you can create a base.html file, and you can create a boilerplate HTML document that looks something like this. So here what I did was type HTML, and VS Code gives you some suggestions. HTML5 is the one I selected, and if you just hit enter, then it gives you a nice document structure to work with, and it has a title and everything. So I'm just going to call this Django Real Estate. Okay, and then inside the head of the document, we add the script for Tailwind. And inside the body, we can work with basically some more Django syntax. So here what I'm doing is creating blocks. So we give it a name. Block content is normally a typical name. And then we end block content. And these blocks allow us to use this template inside other templates. And then all we need to do is just wrap all of our content inside this block, and it essentially gets brought inside this template. So it just allows us to have like one base that all the templates inherit from, and then we don't need to repeat ourselves all the time. So we can save this file. We can go into, for example, the listings template, and here we just say, using the Django syntax, extends from base.html, and then we just create the block content and wrap it around everything that we put inside here. Okay, So we save this, and immediately we can go and see what this looks like. So you can refresh here, and you can see there's a little bit of some styling applied, which is just the default Tailwind styling. Okay. And we can actually add some Tailwind class names to this anchor tag to just demonstrate what it looks like. So first, what I'm going to do is actually inside base.html, I'm going to create a div here and wrap it around this block content. Okay. And on the div, I'm going to specify a class of, first of all, I'll do mx auto and say maximum width, let's say 4XL. Well, actually, maybe we'll make it 5 just to be a bit bigger. And we can specify padding X and maybe some padding Y as well. Just something like that. Okay. And that just gives us a consistent styling for the rest of all the pages. So here inside listings, what I'll then do is create a class on this anchor tag, and I'm going to specify, first of all, padding X and Y. Okay. I'm going to give it a background of gray 100. And I'm also going to specify that it's a bit rounded. All right. So we can already take a look at this, refresh, and we see it looks like this. Okay. And we can also specify a little bit more information about the listing because it's got a lot more information than just the title. So what I'm going to do is create a div that wraps around the anchor tag. And here I'm going to put an h3 tag, which is the title. And then here I'm just going to say view details. Okay. I'm then going to move this whole class onto the div. So it's got the padding on X and Y, the background, and then on the A tag, I'm going to give it a class of text blue 500. On the H3, I'm going to give it a class of, let's say, text 3XL, text gray 900. Save this, and now it looks like this, right? So it looks a little bit better. And if we click on view details, it takes us to the listing page. So now we can pretty much just go to listing and repeat this process. So we can go to, say, extends from base.html. We wrap everything inside the block of content. We end the block. Okay, so now I'm just going to copy this from the listings and I'm going to paste it over here. I'm then going to now add, let's just do a paragraph tag with the price. So I'm going to cut the price out and paste it inside the paragraph tag. I'm going to specify the class with text. Let's do maybe just actual normal text is fine, but I'm going to say text gray 900. Okay, we've already done the title, and then lastly it's just the address. So I'm going to cut that out, put another paragraph tag, paste it inside, specify a class, and I'm going to do text gray 600, text small. All right, we refresh here, and this is what we've got now. Now, view details is actually not necessary anymore because we already are on that page, but it would be good if we could add the edit and the delete links here. Okay. I'm going to add some margin left so that it's a bit split apart like that. And then I'm also just going to wrap both of these inside a div. Right, so both the links are inside a div, and I'm going to specify class py5 and then just give it a border on the top of gray 200. Right, so it looks like that. And in fact, margin top 5 as well, right? So that's what we've got showing there. And we also could add, if we only want the staff users to see this bit here. So what we can do is put if statements as well. We can say if request.user is staff, then we show this here, right? So that would make sure that if you're a logged in user with the staff attributes, you can see this, but otherwise you can't. Now, this doesn't mean that if you go to that page, you won't be able to do it. You actually still would be able to visit these pages. It's just that right now you wouldn't see these links. So handling the permissions on these pages is a little bit more advanced, and that's for another video. But right now we can still go and put in a little bit of template logic here. So we're going to put the edit URL and the delete URL as well. So now both of those are there. If I click on edit, you can see the form displaying. All right, now let's go and change the listing update, right? So this is going to be also, again, pretty much the same as what we've been doing. So we put the block, and we can also put like an H1 tag that says create a new listing, and we can say that there's a class of text for Excel. Okay, so it looks like this. And now the styling when it comes to forms is a little bit tricky and out of the scope for this video as well, because we're using Tailwind, but it's also not something that takes too much effort. It's just something that can be done in a different video. So you've got the form, and I'm just going to copy this and go to listing create and paste it here as well. And then here I'm going to say update listing, right? So we've got that. Now I'm just going to go to, well, actually this was the opposite way around. This should be create a new listing, and then this should be update listing, right? So it looks like that. And then the last one is, well, actually that should be it. Listing create. Yeah, that's all of the templates. So of course there's so much more you can do from here, but this is just a crash course and just to show you what you can do with Django and the speed at which you can build something. I mean, we haven't done a lot, but we have done it pretty quickly because we've got a model. We're able to interact with it in 5 different ways by listing them out, viewing details, updating, deleting, creating new ones, right? If we go to the home page, we could actually add, let's just do it inside listings. And here we'll just create an A tag that says create a new listing. And then here, the href is just going to be /add listing. And then same thing, just add a class name there if you want styling. Right, create a new listing, you click there, and it takes us to the form. Then we can test this out as well. So this is a new home. Hit submit. All right, and then we see it there. This should have been outside the for loop now that I'm seeing that it was duplicated there. Right, so we see it there, and then maybe just the last bit is just some margin top, right? So it looks like this. A real estate website wouldn't be complete without adding some pictures, so that's what we're going to do now. The first thing we need to do is, if we just come back into our listings app and go to our model, we commented out this image earlier on. And so we're going to add an image field to the model. So by saying image equals to models dot image field, and then just opening the brackets. Now we'll be storing technically not an actual file, but actually a link to that file. And there's just one more thing that we'll need to configure in a second, but I first want to show you just what happens when you upload files. Now, to work with files, you can see if you open up the server, you're going to get a warning from Django telling you that you cannot use an image field because Pillow is not installed. And that's because Pillow is the package that you need to install to work with files and images. So we need to stop the server and run pip install Pillow to install that package. Now you can see it's installed, version 9.1.0. And if you want to see all the packages installed, what you can do is say pip freeze and then the arrow sign into requirements.txt. What that does is it creates a requirements.txt file and it stores all the packages that you have installed into that file. So you can keep a record of those packages, which is normally a good thing to do if you have your own project. So we have the requirements there and we have this image field. Now, remember, whenever you make a change to a model, you need to run the make migrations command because we've added a new field to this model, right? And it's going to make that change to the database table. So we run Python manage.py make migrations. Now, in this case, it's saying it's impossible to add a non-nullable field image without specifying a default. This is because once you have an existing table and you're adding a field that technically cannot be null, right? It has to have a value inside that column. Then you need to do a few things just to make sure that it works 100%, which is either to provide a once-off default or you need to define a default value here. But we're not going to define the default value here. We're just going to go with option 1. So what you do is select an option, you press 1 and then enter. And now you just enter a default value, which is just going to be an empty string. So we put 2 quotation marks to make it an empty string, hit enter, and now you have the make migration complete. So there's the second migration file, which we can see here, listing image. And now we just need to migrate to apply that to the database. So we run Python manage.py migrate, and we see okay. Okay, so the migration's complete. We have this image field. So let's go and run the server again. All right, so there's our server running. And now what we need to do is bring this image into our form so that we can actually add an image when we create a new listing. So we just need to go into the forms and then add image as one of the fields that's now included in the fields here. And we can go and test this out. If we go to create a new listing, you can now see here's this image field, and all you need to do is just choose a file, right? So this is like a normal HTML file choosing field that you've seen on the internet. So let's go and try this out. We're going to create a new listing. So we'll say this is a nice house and just fill in the rest of these arguments or fields. Now I'll select an image. All right, so I had a picture of the inside of a house just to work as an example. Click submit, and you'll see this file or this field is required. All right, that's an error that's coming from the form. And the reason for why we're getting this is because of something in the HTML. Because even though I did select an image, it still gave me this error. So it might seem confusing as to why it's giving you this error. Now, to fix this, we just need to go into our templates. We go to the listing create form. And here on the form, now that we're working with submitting files, we need to specify the ENC type property on the form. And the value is multipart/form data. This is very important, and that's basically going to include all the files when you submit this form, right? And there's actually one last thing we need to do after specifying this, and that is if we come back into our views and we go to this listing create view where we handle the form. Now that we're working with files, we need to pass in those files into the form as well. And the way we do that, you can actually see here is the second argument is files, So we specify here request.files. Okay, that's what we're passing in as the second argument. And this is also very important because we need to pass in the files into the form so that everything works 100%. So we had to do this, and we had to add it into our template to specify the ENC type. And with that, we can now head back over here and try this again. So I'm just going to refresh the page, right? Select everything, click submit, and we see it was successful. We see here's the somewhere new house that I just created. And now all we need to do is just display the image because we have an image, so we should display it. And this comes back into the HTML. So let's go into the listings.html. And here we're going to add an image. This is the image tag, just an HTML tag. And the most important property is the src, which stands for source. We're going to use the Django template syntax and put listing.image.url. Now this .image here will access the field on the model, which is here. And then .url is to grab the specific URL of the image. All right. So we save this. We can also put an alt value that's just empty for now. And let's just go and see what this looks like. So we refresh here. Because we had some listings that we created without specifying an image for them, we get this issue that it says the image attribute has no file associated with it. That's because we have two listings that don't have images. So what we can do is update those images on those listings, right? So let's head back into listing update and let's add all the changes like we just did to the listing create. So that's going to be the ENC type specified as multi-part form data. Then we need to go into the views. We need to bring request.files into our listing update form, which is going to be over here. Here, because we're specifying more than one argument, I'm going to specify files equals to request.files like that. And again, this is only if the request method is post, right? So we only need to put it there. So now let's just go back to listings.html. What I'm going to do is just remove this line for a second because otherwise we keep getting this issue. And I'm going to go view the details on these other houses and then edit them and choose an image for it. Right, so I selected a house, we hit submit. Now I'm going to go to the other one, selected a house as well, submit. Great, so now we have all of them with an image selected. So let's head back here and bring back this line to display an image, and let's see if it works. So when we refresh the page, we don't see the images showing up. And if actually you go back to your project, you should see that the images you selected are actually just uploaded into the folder of your project. This is where we need to configure media files. Media files are essentially files that get uploaded, and you can do this inside your settings.py. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll actually see there's a static URL, and this is where you would add the configuration for both static files and media files. The first thing we need to specify is the media URL, which we're going to specify as media, and then the media root. So the media root is actually the folder name that we want to store all of the media files in, which I'm just going to call media. And then the URL is the URL that all of these files will be accessible on. So with that, we can go into the urls.py. And what we're going to do is configure a URL to access all of the media files. So first at the top, we're going to say from django.conf import settings. And then at the bottom, we're going to say if our settings is in debug mode, then we're going to add a URL pattern. And this URL pattern, we can also use an import from Django, which is going to be from django.conf.urls.static import static. And we can add this static, which we call like this. The path is going to be to our settings.media URL, which is accessing this value here. And then we just need to specify the document root, which is going to be settings.media root. So just telling Django that this document root is this value here, which is the media folder. Right now we don't have a media folder, so we can go and create it. Let's save everything. Okay, check that the server's running, and it is. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to delete these 3 pictures, and I'm going to need to re-upload them again because they were saved in the wrong place. So I'm going to view details and edit, submit, and so we can see one showing up. Let's go and edit the other one. Submit. Right, there we can see number 2. And now I just want to go and change number 3. Submit. Okay, so all the images are now showing. And if we come back to the project here, you can see inside the media folder, now we have those 3 pictures. So what we basically did was just configure that Django should upload all the images, or all the files essentially, into this media folder, because we did that inside our settings. We said media root is media. That's the name of the folder. And all of the files are accessible on this media URL. And the way you can check that is if you just inspect the page. So you can right click, inspect. And if you inspect any of these images, you can see that in the source property, it equals to /media/house.jpg. You can also copy that URL, and if you put it into the browser, you'll actually get the image as a response. So we're getting sent that file, and it's available on media/house3.jpg, which is just pointing to this file right here inside the media folder. This works a little bit differently when you deploy a project to a production environment, but for local development, this is perfectly fine. And so now our real estate website is at least a little bit more convincing, because you need to have pictures in order for it to be an actual real estate site. Of course, we can improve on the styling, but that's where I'm going to leave this for now. And so that brings us to the end of the course. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. It really does help. And again, if you're interested in learning more about Django, then check out learn.justdjango.com. The link is in the description down below. And other than that, thanks for watching.